So Jenna Tatum, Jenna, are you there?
Hi, I'm here.
Awesome. Let me give you your introduction.
Thank
Okay, so
you.
Jenna, she's going to be presenting today on developing leadership policies in non-California cities. So
It
Jenna Tatum,
happens. I know. It's crazy.
oh, this is a national movement. We don't have to be California chauvinists. Everyone's doing great. So Jenna Tatum is the director of the Building Electrification Initiative, an organization that provides cities with the knowledge, tools, and resources they need to accelerate the equitable transition away from fossil fuels in buildings. Jenna previously served as a senior policy advisor in the New York City Mayor's Office of Sustainability, where she oversaw the implementation of New York City's energy efficiency programs, managed the building sector analysis for the city's roadmap to the 80-10-50 report, and led development of the city's building electrification strategy. Prior to the New York City's mayor's office, Jenna served as a staff member in the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure, and worked on several political campaigns. Jenna holds a Master's of Public Administration from Columbia University and a Bachelor of Arts from UCLA. Thank you, Jenna, for spending some time with us today.
You're welcome. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen.
Thank you.
Sure. All right. Can you all see it?
Yep, ready to rock.
Awesome, great. Thank you so much for having me, Sean, and thanks for hosting this event and for giving such a voice to all female speakers. I really appreciate the opportunity. So yes, thank you for that introduction. I'm going to be talking about our work developing leadership policies in non-California cities with an emphasis on a couple of cities in cold climates in the hope that that will be helpful and new information for you all. A quick bit of background on BEI, for those of you who don't know us, we work in 11 cities across the country, and you can see our cities here, a few in California, some in the Rocky Mountain area, and then a handful on the East Coast. And today, if I can get my screen to work, let's see. Ooh, there we go. Oops, went too far. Okay. Today, we're going to be looking at some case study cities from Salt Lake City, Utah, and Burlington, Vermont, because like I said, those are two cities with colder climates where we've done some cost analysis that is now leading to the development of new policies and programs in those cities. And so as a bit of overview, we'll start with Salt Lake City and then talk about Burlington. Salt Lake City does have ambitious greenhouse gas reduction commitments, committed to 80% reduction in emissions by 2040. 26% of citywide emissions in Salt Lake City come from the on-site use of natural gas in buildings, quote unquote, natural gas. And it's also useful, I think, to keep in mind that there are significant air quality issues in the city due to its regional geography, which is actually creating some bipartisan support and has led to some ambitious policies statewide for cleaning up air quality in the state. All right, a little slow, okay. And so back actually in 2019, we did a customer economics analysis for Salt Lake City across 4 electrification scenarios and 3 building typologies that we came up with. So 2 scenarios in single family homes, looking at a heat pump as a displacement opportunity, as well as heat pump water heaters in single family homes. We also analyzed ductless mini split retrofits in a multifamily building, but in this case didn't look at the hot water. And then we also analyzed multifamily new construction, all electric. And so today I'm going to be focusing on the multifamily retrofit and the new construction scenarios, but we have additional details that we will be posting online and is also available publicly if anyone's interested. So in terms of the multifamily retrofit, to start off with, a few notes on our assumptions. One is that in our sort of baseline building, we started off with a low efficiency gas system, and then also looked at electric resistance heating systems for comparison to these ductless mini split retrofits. And we started with fairly low efficiency because, one, we think this accounts for losses through the ducts, as well as the fact that low-income properties, which we're really interested in kind of understanding the economic impacts there, they're likely to have older equipment with lower efficiencies. And so we modeled ductless mini splits in terms of both displacement and full replacement scenarios. And we picked ductless mini splits because that was assumed to be higher efficiency than ducted heat pumps. And in the displacement scenario, we also assumed that they wouldn't necessarily install a cold climate heat pump because they'd still have a gas furnace as a backup heating system. So we wanted to test sort of the installation costs for these different scenarios. In some scenarios, we also looked at envelope measures that were included, and this we assumed to be able to decrease the system size and therefore the cost of the retrofit, of the heat pump in the retrofit. And then this isn't listed on the slide, but just for note, we assumed room air conditioners in the baseline building, which could then be removed because the heat pump can also provide cooling. One final note on our assumptions, at this point in time, we weren't really electrical panel upgrades were less on our radar at the time, so we didn't include the cost of upgrading the service of the panels. So that might be an additional cost that should be factored in the future. Okay. Hopefully my screen switches here soon. Oh, there we go. Okay, so I know there's a lot of numbers on this slide. There were a lot of scenarios that we analyzed, but I will pull out a few key takeaways here for you all. One note on the paybacks also before I dive in is that they are incremental paybacks. So they are assuming that the building had to replace the system in any case. So this is an incremental cost over a gas alternative. And so as you can see here, these are ranked sort of in order of payback period. The electric resistance sort of baseline system obviously performs much better and really achieves some pretty decent paybacks within the lifespan of the equipment. And so these are obvious candidates, at least for Salt Lake City, to start with for moving forward with heat pump retrofits. So that's good news. Unfortunately, some of the gas systems, are not going to be performing quite as well because gas is pretty cheap in Salt Lake City. But one thing that did stand out to us is that the first year net operating savings in many cases, including in gas baseline scenarios, there are operating savings. So this is good news for tenants. And actually, we didn't know for sure if this would be true for the gas baseline buildings in Salt Lake City. And so it's good to know that the efficiency of the heat pump can overcome the cost differentials for gas versus electric in these scenarios.
I just want to re-emphasize what a big deal that is.
Yeah, it is a big deal. It really is. And this was really the main takeaway was that, we can provide operational cost savings in this cold climate through a multifamily retrofit. The problem is that the upfront or the installation cost is often too high to then yield paybacks that pay back in the lifetime of the equipment. So you can save on your operational costs, but the owner's not necessarily going to make the money back within the lifespan of the equipment. And so that's just something that we need to overcome through policy, ideally. So for example, one of the things that was driving this is that Salt Lake City has tiered gas and electric rates, that basically if you use more electricity, you'll get charged a higher rate. And so looking at those tiered rates and sort of reversing those for heat pump systems so they're not kind of creating a disincentive for installing heat pumps would be a good place to start. Cool. And then my screen is going slowly here, but yeah, there we go, switching. So just to kind of recap some of the takeaways that's driving decision-making in Salt Lake City that I mentioned, replacing the electric baseboard heating with heat pumps is gonna be a good opportunity with paybacks of 18 years or less in all variations. Many of these gas heating replacement variations do have operational savings or at least are close to breaking even. One thing to note actually was that replacing the existing cooling system in our models didn't improve the economics because we assumed inexpensive window air conditioning units in the baseline building. However, Salt Lake City is getting a lot hotter due to climate change, and it'll be increasingly important to ensure that there's sufficient cooling in buildings. So that might be a reason to install heat pumps above and beyond the economic case. And then, it's just going to be critical to reduce the upfront cost of heat pumps as well as the energy efficiency measures and solar to make the installations more cost effective. We found that incentives of $3,000 to $4,000 per apartment could result in paybacks of under 18 years in many of the gas variations. So that might be the target, that Salt Lake City's pushing its utility, Rocky Mountain Power, on. And then there's also opportunities to increase operational savings, as I mentioned, through adjusting the tiered rates, and also just ensuring that the systems are installed well to ensure optimal efficiency. Cool. Okay, I'm going to keep moving and turn to the new construction analysis, because this is also exciting for Salt Lake City in particular. So we looked at all electric new construction, so not just the heating system, but also the hot water system and stoves. We assumed that all new construction in Salt Lake City would be built with central cooling, given climate change. So that's important to note in terms of the counterfactuals. Our counterfactual furnace efficiency is a little bit low, but it does account for the assumed sort of efficiency losses of ducted systems in our model. And then many of the specific heating and hot water equipment specs and the costs that we used were actually provided by a group called Give Group, which is a leader in affordable multifamily new construction in Salt Lake City. And they've been building all electric buildings for a few years and are really evangelists on it, I would say, and are publicly sharing their plan sets and costing information kind of as widely as possible. So we really relied on them and their experience for this analysis. And we used ductless mini splits, both due to their efficiency and because they required less space than central systems. And we knew that that was a benefit for developers. In terms of the hot water assumptions, so some of these we actually changed probably if we were doing the analysis today. But in 2019, when we were building this out, we went with an integrated heat pump water heater in each apartment, which requires a lot of expensive louver doors and other equipment that kind of drove up the costs. So, there might be changes that we can make to the model. Now, we'd probably model a central split heat pump system instead. But at the time, we thought that the integrated heat pump water heater was at least better than the electric tankless water heaters that we were considering, which can't help manage peak demands. And that seemed to be an issue, especially in cold climates. So just a couple of notes on the water heating assumptions. Okay, and then the results. Really exciting in Salt Lake City's cold climate, also seeing that all electric new construction saves on installed costs. We're finding that it avoids $1,600 per apartment compared to the mixed fuel construction. And also really positive news is that the all electric construction results in operational cost savings. We are finding at least $100 in operational cost savings in year one. So you can see in the chart on the bottom left, the cash flow with those operational savings sort of building over time. And then in the right is the breakdown of the cost savings for the installation costs in Salt Lake City. And so the blue bars are actually the savings. So they kind of go in the opposite direction than you might expect intuitively. But they're driven by, largely the gas infrastructure costs. So avoiding all the gas piping in the building, as well as space heating and cooling reduction. So by only installing one piece of equipment instead of two, there's a cost savings there as well. And we included the incentives that do exist in the Salt Lake City market in addition. So finding similar results, even in a cold climate that we've obviously been hearing throughout California and elsewhere, that all electric new construction is lower cost to build. So that is exciting, and Salt Lake City has felt empowered by kind of the results of this analysis, especially on the new construction side, that it both has a result of lower installed costs and operating costs, really driven by the avoidance of gas infrastructure, as well as on the operational cost savings side, it's driven by the avoidance of the monthly fixed costs for gas service. And there's a lot of increase in new construction on the Wasatch Front, which is where Salt Lake City is located. And so kind of recognizing how much new construction is happening in the next few years, Salt Lake City sees that this is really critical, both to lower emissions, prevent more gas infrastructure build out, and also to lower building costs. And so as a result of this, BEI has been working with Salt Lake City to engage stakeholders in the building, housing, and air quality sectors to socialize these results, and then hopefully be working to at least encourage all electric new construction in Salt Lake City, if not throughout the state, Salt Lake City is actually preempted from passing its own energy code, but we think that other Utah cities and stakeholders could start to move to push the state to at least put all electric new construction on a more even playing field, or create sort of an opt-in energy code for cities who want to push all electric new construction.
And can you
I see a
clarify,
comment.
are
Yeah.
you saying that the little cities can do something that Salt Lake City cannot?
No, I'm saying that all cities in Utah are actually preempted from doing anything different than the state energy code. So it's a very different context, obviously, than California, where cities are really encouraged to enact REACH codes. In Utah, that's prohibited altogether.
Wow.
Yeah. And I see a comment here that the gas industry is working hard to resist building electrification in Utah. That is true. And we are working to kind of start to build the coalition that can push back on that. There's a bill that sort of it's like a ban on gas bans that has been introduced in the Utah legislature. But we think there's enough bipartisan support for initiatives that address air quality without necessarily having to talk about climate change, to hopefully avoid that bill moving forward. It's moved forward out of committee, but hasn't been voted on the floor. And also is a little bit moot because Utah cities can't ban gas anyways, because they're preempted by the state anyways. Cool, so that's Salt Lake City. And yes, like I said, this is sort of some pulled out takeaways from a broader analysis that we did for them that is available publicly, and I can help get access to that to anyone who wants it. So good stuff coming out of our friends in Utah. So next, with the remaining time that I have, I do just want to touch on some newer analysis that we're doing in Burlington, Vermont, which has an even colder climate, which is also fairly promising for moving forward, especially in new construction. But just a bit of context on Burlington. Burlington's committed to net zero carbon by 2030. 30% of the city's greenhouse gas emissions come from on-site gas use in buildings. And the Burlington Electric Department, which is a municipal-owned electric utility, actually already provides 100% renewable electricity. So they know electrification of both buildings and transportation is critical to getting to their net zero carbon goal, and are taking steps as quickly as possible to move that forward. So we also did a customer economics analysis for Burlington. I'm going to present some initial findings on the multifamily building analysis here. We actually started with a dorm that was recently built in Burlington and modified some of the inputs to sort of get a sense of what's being built in Burlington today, and then what the all electric scenarios could look like for that building. And so in this case, we actually modeled 4 all electric scenarios because we weren't entirely sure kind of what the best option was for a very cold climate like Burlington's. And so I'll spend a little time talking through these scenarios, and then we'll run through the results quickly. I think this first one, the air to water heat pump with a basically a water loop is pretty interesting. So this has 3 parts. It has a central air to water heat pump plant, which replaces in a typical new construction building a central boiler and a cooling tower. And then that heat pump plant feeds a condenser water loop that heats to a moderate temperature of about 70 to 80 degrees. And that actually exists in this building that we started with in the baseline building. And then each apartment unit or dorm unit has a packaged heat pump that then fully heats the water from the condenser water loop for space heating and cooling to get it all the way out to the temperature needed in Burlington's climate. And so this is actually a pretty common setup. We just basically swapped out the central boiler and cooling tower with a central air to water heat pump plant. And another benefit of that, or a couple other benefits, it provides simultaneous heating and cooling. So one unit could be heating while the other unit is cooling. And then it also uses less refrigerant than a VRF, which is kind of a good thing. Okay, and then quickly, the other scenarios we looked at an air source heat pump only scenario where we basically modeled mini splits for each apartment. And then the domestic hot water system is a central system that is actually a 2-stage system that relies on the central heat pump to, again, heat the water to a moderate temperature of 70 to 80 degrees. And then a second heat pump is needed to further heat the water up to 100+ degrees that's needed for a hot water system. We also looked at air source heat pump with electric resistance backup. And I think it's important to note that that was actually not out of concern that the air source heat pumps wouldn't be able to function on the very coldest days, which we're defining as below 5 degrees, but actually because it allowed us to size the cold climate air source heat pumps smaller and then therefore potentially reduce the installation costs of the retrofit overall. And then lastly, we looked at a ground source heat pump system as, sort of in an ideal kind of ground scenario. That could be an option as well for these buildings. And all of these buildings are actually built above code in Burlington because the city works pretty actively with developers to ensure that buildings are built with a high level of efficiency. Okay, a lot of information on this slide. Thanks for bearing with me. So for the results, so we looked at both the costs of the heating and hot water system and compared it to the baseline building. And the good news is that almost all scenarios are, in fact, slightly cheaper to build, even in Burlington's cold climate. The one exception is the air source heat pump only scenario. So you can see here, this is the baseline building with the gas systems, and then these are the installation costs per square foot for our retrofit scenarios, and the air source heat pump only building is the one that comes out a little bit more expensive. And that's actually partly driven by the domestic hot water system because of that two-staged sort of system. It requires an additional amount of equipment being installed in the building. Also, the air source heat pump only building requires larger outdoor units to provide enough heat in the Burlington climate. We actually modeled the systems to work down to -20 degrees because it does get that cold from time to time in Burlington. So that's kind of what's driving the costs there. And then I should also note that the ground source heat pumps are assuming ideal ground conditions, which may not always be the case. Those costs could actually vary quite a bit. And then last note, it does actually also include the electrical capacity costs for new panels and conduit in the building. So we did actually add those costs into this analysis, recognizing that that is often necessary. Okay, and then in terms of operating costs. So I actually showed two charts on this slide because I think it's important to look first at the energy use outcomes because they're pretty dramatic. You can see here that our all electric scenarios reduce energy use by between 57 and 67% compared to the baseline gas building. So pretty dramatic outcomes. This is really good for obviously climate reasons. But then in terms of operating costs, it's a little bit of a more complicated picture. And that is, in part because of the differential between gas versus electric rates in Burlington. You can see the blended rates that we used down here. When you convert the electric rate over to therms, it's about 7 times higher than the gas rate. So that's a pretty large differential to overcome. And then also the DHW is a major driver of the operating costs because of that two-stage heat pump system that I described, which reduces the efficiencies of the heat pump water heater because it has to go through two stages.
So just noting that is a big jump, like from $50,000 to $60,000, in the best case scenario.
Yeah, and these are heating, cooling, and hot water costs specifically. This might look a little bit less scary if you include the all-in energy operating costs, because this doesn't include in-unit apartment electric or other energy costs. But yeah, it is a pretty big jump, and this obviously does scare us a bit, especially when thinking about the impacts to low-income tenants.
What we've seen in California at least is that the solar array costs, because they have a pretty rapid payback and lower the cost of electricity, et cetera, that is a way to break through, is to lower the cost of electricity by using solar power.
That is a great point. And, I definitely think that's worth modeling here and not included here yet. I mean, and we're also working with the Burlington Electric Department. So I think asking BED if there can be a heat pump specific rate to try to overcome that gas versus electric differential is another potential option, right? So we're not saying this is where we're stuck forever, but it is where we are today. And the next step is figuring out what are we going to do to bring down those operating costs so they're not quite so scary.
Cool.
So lastly, and I am almost done, we did also look at the life cycle costs for new construction just to kind of get a perspective of, if this is a long-term developer and owner of the building, like what does this look like for them? And the good news is that in 3 of the 4 scenarios, the total life cycle cost does come out sort of good for the owner. There's lower life cycle costs. So those lower installed costs are able to offset the higher operating costs. So you can see the stars here represent sort of the life cycle costs relative to the gas baseline, which is set at 0 here. So 3 of the 4 either, break even or are lower. And what's good about, that is that Burlington was actually encouraged enough by those results to take steps to move forward with a proposed policy to start to require all electric construction or require builders of mixed fuel buildings to pay a fee. And that fee could be used to help offset, costs for lower income buildings or, find different creative ways to help bring down operational costs. Like we saw the differential there. So still working out the details of that policy, but the mayor has committed to working on it, which is exciting.
That's awesome. Are you saying that it's adopted or that it's to be adopted?
It's a proposed policy, and I think that the details are going to be worked out, but the city council and the mayor are very committed, to getting something over the finish line that achieves the goals of building electrification and reducing fossil fuel infrastructure and new construction. Yeah. Cool. And so that's what I've got. And I know I didn't leave a ton of time for questions, but I do have a couple minutes.
Yay! Nice done. Thank you for leading outside of California.
Yeah. And I see a question in the chat. It says, did the ground source heat pump account for potential long-term lowering of ground temperature that could result from meeting the heating load? That is a great question. I don't actually know the answer to that, but I would be happy to ask our engineer who led the work on all of this and get back to you. Sean, maybe I could send an answer back over to you.
Okay, that'd be cool. If you can put the email address of that person, by the way, if you know them off the hand, into the chat here. There's another way you could facilitate communication.
Absolutely. My email address is up on the slide, and I'll also put it in the chat if you want to just email me directly. Please feel free.
That would be awesome. Okay. So thank you, Jenna.